Thank you. That ends topical questions. We now move to First Minister's questions. Question 1, Kezia Dugdale.
To ask the First Minister what engagements she has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you. A Facebook plea was recently made for volunteers to help under-pressure NHS staff at the A&E department of the Royal Alexandria Hospital in Paisley. Does the First Minister still think there isn't a crisis in Scotland's NHS?
First Minister.
Well, can I make very clear to Kezia Dugdale and indeed to members across the Chamber the circumstances of the Facebook advert that Kezia Dugdale talks about. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde were seeking volunteers to offer a befriending service in the accident and emergency of the Royal Alexandria Hospital. NHS Glasgow has similar befriending volunteers working elsewhere in the hospital currently. These volunteers do not replace NHS staff. They do not give any form of clinical care. Instead, they might accompany patients who are on their own and can provide general information to patients and to relatives. All health boards have volunteering policies, and volunteers have provided support to patients in the NHS for many, many years. And I think this is a good opportunity for all of us across the Chamber to thank the many people who volunteer in our National Health Service.
Kezia Dugdale.
Presiding Officer, volunteers play a valuable role in our NHS, but there is no avoiding the fact that this is the first time the befriending service has been extended to A&E. And by God, you need a friend if you've been waiting 17 hours in an A&E department. I know from speaking to NHS patients and staff across Scotland that our health service is at breaking point. These are people who need treatment and the dedicated staff who provide it. They do a wonderful job, but they are struggling and they need support from their government. Can the First Minister tell us whether the rise in the number of acute patient cases in Scotland's NHS has been matched by staff increases?
First Minister.
There has been, I think, a 6.5% increase in the number of staff working in the National Health Service since this government took office. We are all well aware of the pressures on our National Health Service. A couple of weeks ago, when Kezia Dugdale and I had an exchange on the challenges that face our National Health Service in England, I explained then the increase in attendances, perfectly genuine attendances, that Greater Glasgow and Clyde in particular had been seeing at its accident and emergency units from very sick older people, many of them frail elderly people with respiratory conditions. So we know the pressures that our health service is working under. That's why this government has been increasing funding for our health service. It's why we've been increasing the number of people who work in our health service. Only this week, the Health Secretary announced an additional £100 million to tackle the challenge of delayed discharge in our health service. So we will continue to do everything we possibly can to support those working at the front line in our National Health Service. And it's perhaps because we work so hard to do that, Presiding Officer, that a poll this week found that twice the number of people in Scotland trust the SNP with the health service than trust Labour.
Kezia Dugdale.
Time and time again, the First Minister comes to this chamber to tell us about increased NHS staff numbers, and we heard it again there today, 6.5%. But the reality is that the number of acute NHS patients in Scotland has risen by more than 10%. That is an extra 1.4 million patient cases since 2007. Yet the number of NHS staff to treat these patients lags far behind. The Scottish Government's £30 million this year to tackle the problem of bed blocking is welcome, but it isn't enough, because tackling bed blocking isn't the whole picture. The problem isn't just at the back door, it's on the front line. Scottish Labour would use the Barnett consequentials to set up a £100 million frontline fund to deliver more NHS patient services in the evenings and weekends where they are needed the most. Let's try that consensus thing again. Will she back Scottish Labour's plans for the NHS?
Cabinet Secretary. First Minister.
When Labour finally comes up with some coherent, costly plans for the National Health Service, then in the interests of consensus, I will be very happy to consider them in that open and constructive way. The fact of the matter is here, Labour's figures don't add up. Now, I don't know if Kezia Dugdale was listening to the debate we had on the budget bill yesterday. Jackie Bailey, who I don't know if she's in the chamber right now, I can understand why she might have chosen not to be, she spent most of her speech calling for additional money for local government. Yeah. And then when she was challenged to say where that money should come from, she said that was too complicated a question for her to answer. And then in the next breath, we had a call for more funding for the health service, again with figures that don't add up. So I will tell Kezia Dugdale what, as First Minister, I will continue to do. I will continue to provide real money for the National Health Service, real increases to the National Health Service from a real balanced budget that this government puts forward. We have increased the health budget in real terms since 2010 by 4.6%. Health boards, territorial health boards next year will get above inflation increase of 3.4%. We will continue to deliver for the health service, working with them to address the challenges. And I say again, it's because we do that. It's because we stand with our health service to make sure it's equipped to deliver that 42% of people trust the health service more than double, trust the SNP to run the health service more than double the number that trust Labour.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister has £113 million worth of unallocated Barnett consequentials. We're asking for £100 million of it. That's real money to tackle a real problem, and it's about time she took responsibility for it. The SNP pat themselves on the back about the opinion polls, but over Christmas a Portakabin was given a lick of paint and used as an integral part of our NHS. £30 million for bed blocking is welcome, but it won't make the Scottish Government's NHS crisis go away. Scottish Labour is putting the NHS first. When will the First Minister do the same?
First Minister.
Says that we should provide money from unallocated consequentials to the health service. The only problem with that from Kezia Dugdale is she's also asking us to make money available for local government, for a resilience fund, for a whole list of other things. So if Kezia Dugdale is now saying it's not Labour's position for us to use the consequentials to set up a resilience fund to help people in the North East economy, then that's a change in Labour's position, but I think she should clarify it. Can I come back to the fundamentals here? This is about patients and staff in our National Health Service. Now, Kezia Dugdale might want to talk about Portakabins, but I think what the people across the country, and certainly in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, will be interested to know is that a new hospital at a cost of £850 million is close to being finally constructed in the City of Glasgow. The Finance Secretary visited it yesterday. That's the investment this government is putting into our health service. So we'll continue to invest real money from real budgets in our health service, supporting those at the front line, and frankly, will leave Labour to their own fantasy economics.
Question 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think I may just know the answer to this question, but to ask the First Minister when she'll next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
In round about an hour's time.
Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. Yesterday, John Swinney announced that he was tearing up his previous rates and bans on the new land and buildings transaction tax and replacing them with more generous rates. He was able to do this because the Conservative-led government in Westminster had itself cut stamp duty, a cut which was reflected in Scotland's block grant. Can the First Minister tell me today, does she think this tax cut, helping homeowners across the UK and in Scotland, would have happened if Ed Miliband had been Prime Minister?
First Minister.
I think this gives me such a massive opportunity here to I suppose, reflect on what I think is a curiosity in Scotland, and Labour probably won't want to hear this. Yesterday there was a poll published in Scotland that showed that Ed Miliband, a Labour leader in Scotland, has managed to find himself in a position where he has even lower approval ratings than a deeply popular Tory Prime Minister. I don't know how they've managed to do that, but nevertheless. And I think the answer to that question, for people who look at the Westminster establishment and don't fancy what they see from either side, the answer to that is to vote SNP and get strong voices standing up for Scotland. And now, on the question of LBTT, I'm very proud that John Swinney yesterday put forward tax proposals that take out of taxation altogether, in terms of house transactions, 50% of people at the bottom end of the housing market. I think that's a fantastic achievement. It will help first-time buyers, and I hope Ruth Davidson will warmly welcome it.
Ruth Davidson.
I warmly welcome appearing on the next Conservative leaflet to pop through doors. David Cameron is a deeply popular Prime Minister, so says the First Minister of Scotland. But it's strange, First Minister, that, Presiding Officer, this is a First Minister who will happily pass on a Conservative tax cut, and yet is the same First Minister who wants to help Ed Miliband get into Downing Street so that she can stop just such tax cuts taking place. But let me ask a point of detail about yesterday's stamp duty reforms. When John Swinney first announced his rates in October, he said, and I quote, "I have decided that the taxes raised should be revenue neutral, raising no more or less than the taxes that they replace." And he repeated that principle several times yesterday in this very chamber. Following the Chancellor's tax cut, the Deputy First Minister had an additional £64 million to pass on in yesterday's budget. His climb down, however, only amounts to £53 million. And those numbers were confirmed to us by the Scottish Parliament's own Independent Information Service this morning. So that's an extra £11 million that will have to be paid by home buyers in Scotland. So my question is, why has this First Minister not passed on the full £64 million to Scottish taxpayers as promised, and what is she planning to do with the other £11 million?
First Minister.
The answer to that, of course, is very simple, and I'm sure John Swinney would be very happy to write in detail providing the answer, but I'll give it to her right now. The tax changes announced by John Swinney yesterday are revenue neutral, and we, of course, had to wait for the detail of the block grant adjustment. But there are two other factors that John Swinney has been very open about taking into account: the effect of forestalling, and also John Swinney's indication, which he made earlier as well, that a contribution will be made to the reserve. So that is the definition that he has always given of revenue neutrality, and I'm sure the Finance Secretary will be very happy to set out the detail of that in writing to Ruth Davidson. Can I say finally two other points to Ruth Davidson? I'm glad she's given me the opportunity today to say very clearly again that the SNP would not, in any circumstances, formally or informally, prop up a Tory government, because Scotland doesn't vote Tory, and I don't see that changing any time soon. But the last point, Presiding Officer, applies both to Ruth Davidson and to Kezia Dugdale. Isn't it rather strange that on the day the UK government are publishing their draft legislative clauses supposedly implementing the Smith proposals, we don't have Labour or the Tories with the gumption to stand up here and say that the vow's been delivered, because they know it's not.
Margaret Fraser.
Thank you. Can the First Minister tell us, is it true that contractors working on the new women's prison project in Greenock will be told tomorrow that the project is not now going ahead?
First Minister.
Well, as Murdo Fraser is aware, Michael Matheson has said he's considering this issue very carefully, and I think it is absolutely correct that as a new Justice Secretary he takes the time to do that. It will not come as any surprise to anybody in this chamber to know that it's an issue Michael Matheson and indeed myself as First Minister and the Government have been looking at carefully, because we want to make sure that the decision that is taken here is the right decision. And I also want to make clear that my view is that all of us across this chamber should be determined to work to reduce not just the prison population generally, but the female prison population